I'll be spending some time today to just give a glimpse of the works of Abhat Kishore Saran, A.K. Saran, who was one of the foremost thinkers who thought on this confluence of tradition, modernity, Hinduism, all through the 20th century. So A.K. Saran's lifetime has been from 1922 to 2003. Pretty much, he was through his lifetime, he was trying to analyze the thought currents that were popular in pretty much all of 20th century. So when you go through his works, you really get a glimpse of everything that is happening both in India and outside the world on these themes broadly. So now I'll probably also spend some time to explain why these themes are important today, because a lot of these themes continue to show up in various forms of discussions in our times today. There is a theme of modernization where people want to modernize at all costs, and there is a theme of secularism or secularization where the state is more and more trying to intervene into realms which are really around religious and traditional realms. So these conflicts keep playing out all the time, and that continues to happen even to our day to day. In fact, some would say that perhaps the strength of these currents of secularization and modernization are perhaps the strongest in our times now compared to times before, because we don't have too many practitioners of tradition, or neither do we have too many public voices who are talking on behalf of tradition. So in that context, I think a lot of the works of A.K. Saran continue to stay of relevance for us. And he was one of the most radical spokesmen of tradition in his times. So he belonged to this school of thought, which is called Philosophia Perennis, where there were a bunch of scholars, not just Hindu scholars. You can think of it as scholars across religions, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, so on. These were all scholars who were doing a whole lot of research in the 20th century, trying to understand what does it mean to be traditional in a modern world, and trying to get various interpretations across various sources of traditions. So you can think of A.K. Saran as an intellectual successor of somebody like A.K. Kumaraswamy, who was again somebody who has done stellar work on these themes. Now, through his work, A.K. Saranji was particularly very critical about some traits of modernity. So when you look at his works as opposed to, let's say, the works of several other popular thinkers, you also get this perspective of trying to engage critically with modernity and with technology and with sciences as well. So I'll try to touch those themes today. And I'm hoping that this talk will open up avenues for more and more people to engage with this kind of a discourse, because this kind of discourse really gives you a holistic perspective of the predicaments of our times today. And it's not just about us Hindus versus them Muslims, or us Hindus versus them Marxists, or us Hindus versus them liberals. It's not that kind of a dichotomy, and there's a much more larger context around what is happening in our times today. And I'm just hoping to throw some light on those themes through A.K. Saran's works, so that more and more of thinking individuals can engage on these themes, and then we can hope for some kind of a new formulation emerge out of it over time. So again, when you look at these themes, some of these are also touched today in terms of, let's say, what is called postmodernism, post-colonialism, so on. But A.K. Saran's works really is not bucketed in those spheres, though there is some kind of an overlap. But Saranji's work is more and more grounded on looking at it from a traditional framework, and not looking at it from an epistemic framework, which is rooted in, let's say, humanities and that kind of discourse. So these themes that I'm going to talk about today, they have been covered in a couple of books of his. One is this one, which is called The Theories of Secularism and Modernization. And another is this, which is Hinduism in Contemporary India. So we'll also be providing both these links along with the video once it gets uploaded, so that anybody interested in engaging more can purchase these books and also read. There are also a couple of articles of his on the internet in some websites, and they'll also be provided as reference, so that anybody interested can read some of this. All right, so that's a bit of his brief, and these lectures that I'm going to refer to or let's say the time frame of 1965 to 1975 to 80. And some of them have been delivered at the Harvard University. There is a divinity school associated with Harvard University, and A.K. Sarangi was invited there then, and some of these themes were delivered there. And there is also another not so popular institute in India, which is called Indian Institute of Advanced Studies in Shimla, where they do quite good research on some of these themes over the years. And some of the lectures that I'm referring to through the course of this talk, they have been delivered in that institute in Shimla. So let's jump straight into the theme here for today, which is the secularism, secularization, and modernization. So before we go into the Indian context, it also helps to understand why did these themes even emerge and where did they emerge? And it is in this context that A.K. Sarangi really tries to go back to the European era of the 13th, 14th centuries, and then he tries to draw a narrative from there that you need to understand Christianity, you need to understand Christianity in Europe in those times, and then you need to see how secularism really emerged from those kind of undercurrents. So if you look at the 13th century Europe, and Sarangi here is referring to works of scholars like Arnold Toynbee and many others who have done these long frame studies on civilizations to understand how societies and civilizations get shaped and get breakdown, so on. So some of these are themes that are that have been told by scholars in the past as well. So here, in the context of the 13th century Europe, A.K. Saran says that if you look at what characterizes that era, there is a breakdown of Christian morals at that time. There was a bitter and endless theological controversies going on between various sects of Christianity, and hence there was sectarian intolerance between various flavors of Christianity then. And of course, there was also persecution. So in this context of a breakdown of Christian morals and then a lot of these theological controversies, that's where this whole concept of the cultivation of natural science and consequent development of technology, this emerged as a parallel track. And the way this track was portrayed was that it was portrayed as a solution to the problem of all these theological polemics and to the cure for this religious separatism and even persecution. So really, you are having all these people quarreling over religion, and then this whole new thing called natural science and technology emerges around the 13th century time frame, and then it goes on from there. And the thesis then really was that unlike all these religious sectarian conflicts that were happening, science has clear procedures for settling disputes, and science produces results which everybody likes and everybody is interested in. So you can all participate in that endeavor collectively despite all these differences. So essentially, A.K. Saran and other such scholars, they say that science and technology was recommended as a substitute for religious sectarian fanaticism at that time. It was a substitute for fanaticism of religion and not a substitute for religion itself. That's a key differentiator. But then this recommendation of trying to propose that science and technology is a substitute for religious fanaticism, that kind of blew up over time. And this recommendation has had far-reaching consequences. So though, as I mentioned, science and technology was not supposed to replace religion or theology and metaphysics, eventually they were independently getting pursued. But what happened in this process is that they upset the traditional hierarchy of knowledge, which means that some of this also applies to the Indian society, that how was knowledge really perceived? Was there a hierarchy of knowledge in terms of what kind of knowledge is high, what kind of knowledge is low, and who should pursue what, so on. When I say high, low here, it's more in the sense of what is transcendental, what is material, and that sort of a plane. So this pursuit of science and technology and natural science as a path on its own, it upset that traditional hierarchy, and the autonomy of secularism also kind of emerged from there. And hence, Sarangi says, so hence secularization thus became a rival to religion itself. And that A.K. Saran says is the difference in context between Western secularism and Indian secularism. That in the West, what started from 13th century, over time, it manifested in such a way that secularism and secularization, it became a rival to religion itself. And that kind of a model didn't operate that way in India. And that's where he says that we need to draw a line between a Western context of secularism and a non-Western context of secularism, particularly in the Indian context. And here he says that there is a difference between the Christian worldview and the Indian worldview, obviously. So you have the Judeo-Christian view of creation, where creation happens on a certain time, and then there is a judgment day, and then the linear kind of a view, which is quite popular, that most people are aware of, at least at a high level. And then you have the Indian view of creation, which is talks about beginninglessness, endlessness, cycles of creation, of Srishti, Sthiti, Pralaya. So you have this thing of two different worldviews really there, and that's why the conflict resolution mechanisms between these worldviews were also largely different. So if you look at the sectarian conflicts that have emerged within India over time, let's say various flavors of religious thought that came up, even things like Buddhism and Jainism, they didn't lead to the same kind of conclusions in India the way the sectarian conflicts led to in 13th century Europe. So that's a contrast that A.K. Sarangi tries to draw, to say that the conflict resolution mechanisms of these sectarian conflicts within the Hindu fold were very different from how it manifested, let's say, in the 13th century Christian Europe. And neither was there a conflict between science and religion in India. So these are like two distinguishing factors on how the Indian context on secularism is very different from the Western context on secularism. Now, if you look at how secularism from there manifested before it came down to India through the colonial era, there were like 2-3 patterns, if you or 2-3 categorizations around secularism. So those are the differences that Sarangi tries to bring. He says that there is one part of secularism, or one school of secularism, which talks about religion being the private affair of the individual. So in common parlance, it's pretty much how it is manifesting today in our times. So your religion, your puja room. So you just limit it to your puja room and your own private pursuit within the 4 walls of your house. Do whatever you want. That's secularism for me. So you do what you want in your home, I'll do what I want in my home, and we are secular. So that's one sort of an imagination. And then there is another imagination of this, the classic state and church separation kind of thing, where the assumption is that religion can be effectively isolated from all other spheres of social and political life. And then you can say that this is the religious sphere, and this is the secular governance kind of a sphere. So you have these two patterns. One is thinking that religion is just a private affair, and another is this assumption that religion can be effectively isolated from other spheres of social life. And then there is the third pattern, which again is one more manifestation of secularism. And I can say that it's one of the most predominant manifestations of secularism that we can see in our time, which is that it's a rejection of everything sacred, mythological, transcendent in the world. So you basically just reject all of that. You reject hierarchical social systems, and you substitute all of this with a very scientific, humanistic, empirical, and evolutionary worldview, and an egalitarian social system. At least you aspire for that. So then in this kind of a context where you are rejecting everything sacred, rejecting anything that is mythological, and rejecting everything that is transcendent, and replacing traditional social systems, in that context, secularism really becomes basis of all authority. So it's not anymore of saying that XYZ is secular and ABC is not secular. When your ambitions get into this zone of trying to recreate this whole scientific, humanistic, empirical kind of a world, then secularism really becomes the basis of all authority. So Sarangi tries to contrast between these 3 flavors of secularism and how they came back to impact India when British came to India as a part of the colonial context. And here he also makes some very interesting remarks, which I think is important for this audience, that if you look at this third view of the rejecting everything sacred and then leaning onto the scientific humanistic worldview, it kind of converges into the idea of the autonomy and centrality of man. So it is just the human, the person who is there, and there is nothing godly or nothing otherworldly or transcendent about human, and it is just the autonomy and centrality of man that gets primacy. And A.K. Saran says that in our modern times, the most systematic and thorough and powerful formulation of this flavor of secularism is to be found in Karl Marx. So he says that any modern philosophy that is not grounded on transcendent metaphysics or revelation, it has a fundamental kinship with Marx. So let me just repeat that, because it's a very profound insight, that all modern philosophy that is not grounded on transcendent metaphysics or revelation has a fundamental kinship with Marx. And this is something that a lot of us can really understand if you look at what has been happening in the country in the past few decades. that no matter, I mean, governments keep changing all the time, but if you look at the large undercurrents that are playing around our time, it is this thing of the autonomy and centrality of man, and then this whole kinship with Marx. Because really the dominant ideology that is presented by means of the constitution and the law, they don't have anything transcendent about them. There is no transcendent metaphysical aspect, neither in our law or neither in the constitution. Although they may be paying some token respect with slogans like Yato Dharmastato Jaya and things like that, or with some Hindu imagery in the books. But the fact is that there is nothing transcendent about a lot of our law books and constitutions, and we are pretty much molded in this image of a very secular, scientific, humanistic, empirical kind of a worldview. Now, if you look at how this has translated post-independence for us, you have all these currents, and then you have this current of trying to anglicize, trying to westernize. And in that context, you have this new thing now that has emerged, let's say post-independence, called patriotism and nationalism. So again, here, A.K. Sarangi gives some very, very interesting insights. These are very powerful statements, and they need a lot more pondering, and these are not things to generate outrage really, but these are important things to think on. So A.K. Sarangi says that nationalism has no meaning outside a secular context, and Hindu nationalism, he says, is a contradiction in terms. So let me repeat. He says nationalism has no meaning outside a secular context, and Hindu nationalism, he says, is a contradiction in terms. Now, these are powerful statements, because a lot of us who are born, let's say, post-independence in a kind of curriculum that has already imbibed these ideologies, we kind of take to nationalism very naturally. But at that point in time, in that century, there were also these currents going on trying to understand, what do you mean when you say nation? What does it even mean? And there are people who have thought on those lines as well and try to understand the contradictions or the competing demands between this idea of a nation and the idea of a traditional jati or Bharatiyata, so on. And so you have this nationalism that emerges, and then you have secularism as a concept also that emerges because of the Hindu-Muslim fault lines in independent India. And then with all this, you get this modern Western theory of state and government, where the state represents the will of the people and people are sovereign. And A.K. Sarangi says that this kind of theory of state is very, very different from what we had in tradition, which is that the state does not represent people and their will, but it is a vehicle for dharma. So the king rules over territory and people in the name of dharma and in order to maintain it. It's not about people's will in the same sense as it is in the context of a modern state. So with the birth of independent India, it's all these forces, they came together, and then secularism along with modernization, it kind of became a defining characteristic for the nation state. And it is here that A.K. Saran says that Hindu society and Hindu religion are inseparable, at least in practice. Meaning, in theory, you can still think of a formulation of something being a Hindu society and something else being a Hindu religion. But in practice, at least till it was, let's say, before the British came into power, despite the Islamic onslaught, Hindu society and Hindu religion were never separable. They were together and they were one whole. And it is here that these two meanings of secularism that we spoke of early on, of the state being religiously neutral and separate, that this is a secular realm and this is a religious realm, and then this whole thing around freedom and autonomy of man, these ideologies of secularism come in conflict with the ideas of around Hindu society and Hindu tradition. And here A.K. Sarangi gives an example of the whole effort that went around, let's say, the uniform civil code at that time, which translated into selectively changing only the Hindu law, but not disturbing the Muslim law. And it is in these contexts that he also brings up this whole thing of secularism, secularization and modernization in the context of how it panned out differently in Hindu society and how it panned out differently, let's say, amongst practitioners of Islam. And here he again brings up this great insight where he says that the modernizing and developmental function of the Indian state is clearly in conflict with the religious neutrality ideology of the same state. So a state which is trying to modernize and develop the whole population and the country at large, what it is trying to adopt in the means of in this path of trying to modernize and develop the country, a lot of those acts are in conflict with the religious neutrality ideology, because you are ending up getting into a religious tradition, religious territory, and trying to define a lot of customs, reforms, and things like that. And you're also doing this selectively for one religion and not doing it for another religion. So it is in this context that he says that while we talk of secularism, secularism it gets manifested through secularization, and secularization brings along with it as a package the whole ideology around modernization, and it is these two together that they are in conflict with the religious neutrality of the Indian state. And here he also says this. This is something that other scholars of religion also have said in the past, that a lot of people today and in the past, in the colonial era, they have seen that a belief in the karma theory is obstructive of economic progress, and hence it must be reformed and replaced. So people think that what has really held back India, why didn't India, let's say, have the industrial revolution? Why didn't India develop as much as, let's say, some other country like Europe or some other place? Some of them put the blame on the karma theory. They say that because you have this whole belief in the karma theory, you didn't progress. It is because that theory was obstructing your economic progress. And hence, now that we are in this path of modernization, that whole thing around karma needs to be reformed and replaced. So this is again a current that has gained currency in the 20th century. So here, in this context, A.K. Saran says that this idea of having a planned socio-economic system based on humanistic values, it's a total system. So it's like an end-to-end holistic system. And this total system is irreconcilable with any other total system. And in this context, the other total systems that were present at that point in time in India were Hinduism or even Islam. So Hinduism is a total system on its own, which kind of, like the cradle to grave kind of a system, where although grave is a Christian analogy, but nevertheless, it's a kind of system that tries to address pretty much everything that happens all through the life, from birth to death, across cycles and across time frames of past, present, and future. And then you have this new total system, which is again a planned socio-economic system based on the autonomy of man and humanistic values and the scientific and empirical kind of a worldview. So it's one total system trying to talk to another total system. So they cannot be synthesized, and that's a broad theme that A.K. Saranji tries to attack all through his works. That this whole imagination we have that anything can be synthesized in Sanatan Dharma, in Hindu Dharma, he says that is patently wrong, and that is not something that has given us returns in the past, and there is no hope that it's going to give us return in the future as well. We cannot assume that two total systems will seamlessly merge into each other and then something new will emerge on its own, or they'll just synthesize on its own. There are costs that you need to pay in this process, and sometimes that the costs may be so huge that this whole idea of trying to merge two total systems together needs to also be questioned. And it is here that A.K. Saranji talks about this whole idea of modernization, the way it came out in the colonial context, that you have this idea that non-Western people need to be modernized. And there is this idea that socialist revolution is required for the world communism. And there is this idea that the scientific industrial forms of life, which interestingly are common to both the modernization project and to the communist socialist project. You have this idea of scientific industrial form of life, and Saran says that all these are they are like the latest forms of this universal spirit of European civilization. So you have this idea that scientific industrial forms of life is the thing. It is what every other culture needs to adapt itself to. And he says that this idea that the scientific industrial form of life is what everybody should do, is you need to see it in a line of succession. So you had this first idea of an imperial idea of a Roman Empire, and then you have this Christian idea of a Christendom, and then you have the white man's burden, where the British Empire, and then them trying to civilize others. And then because the Christian idea of a Christendom and then the white man's burden both didn't succeed as much as they should have, you have this new idea that has emerged, which is a new universal, which is a scientific industrial form of life. So A.K. Saranji tries to engage critically even with that concept and he questions back that why should that one form of life, why should that be a universal? And what is so special about it that all other civilizations need to let go of something to adapt to this? So there are some very interesting thoughts that he has in that context. And it is here that A.K. Saranji kind of delves deeper into the Hindu context, where he says that if you're trying to look at this whole process of external entities coming with their own ideologies, be it secularism or modernization, and trying to change or reform the Hindu society, you need to look at it in the context of history, so or our past. So he talks about the conflicts or the friction between Hinduism and Buddhism, and again here he makes some very interesting remarks which are kind of lost in a lot of modern day discourse on Buddhism, where people kind of think of it as a complete religion which had a solution to every other thing that Hinduism was trying to accomplish, and they kind of assume that it's one total system trying to replace another total system using the earlier analogy. But in this case, A.K. Saranji kind of goes deeper into Buddhism and brings up this analogy that Buddhism is really expressed through the monastic way of life. So you have these monasteries and then you have these monks. That is where really Buddhism finds its expression. And hence, A.K. Saran says that Buddhism in an important way is outside society. So you have society and then you have the order of the monastic life or the monks. So Buddhism, he says, is outside society. And apart from many vested interests and historical factors that were involved in Hindu opposition to Buddhism in India, one persistent complaint A.K. Saran says that what worked really against the mass or large-scale adoption and life of Buddhism on this land was really this non-social character, which is that it was a monastic, primarily it was a monastic driven kind of a religion, and all of the action was really happening outside the regular society. So it was really a non-social character of that Buddhist religion, which kind of led to the lack of adoption over centuries on Buddhism. And that's a pattern that many others have also noticed in the past. Now, what here A.K. Saran says that while Buddhism could not really revolutionize the basic Hindu social structure, it did challenge and damage the priestly order, and Buddhists did oppose rituals and yajnas and all that, but its non-social characteristics and fundamentally its metaphysical agreement with a broader Hindu framework, this led to this strange phenomena where Hinduism really absorbed Buddhism within its fold over time. And this, he says, is one example of a kind of secularism, you could say, where one faith really absorbed another faith. That's kind of a pattern which we thought we could do with Islam as well. And that's where A.K. Saran jumps next into the next epoch. So you have the Buddhist epoch, where because fundamentally that of the non-social characteristics of Buddhism and because of the metaphysical similarities between Buddhism and Hinduism, in the sense that both were transcendental religions, that they were otherworldly religions, so to say, and not a pure mechanistic or just a Dehatmavadi religion, one could say, of just believing that the body is what it is and there is nothing else beyond it. So Buddhism and Hinduism do have metaphysical similarities there, and because of all this, Hinduism could successfully absorb Buddhism. But this didn't happen in the same way with the Muslim conquest. So here, A.K. Saran says that for the first time, Hindus really faced a challenge of living in a non-Hindu world when Islam, the whole Islamic conquest happened. And that, A.K. Saran says, is the first challenge of secularism to Hindu society, in the sense that secularism understood here as a multi-faith society. So until then, Hinduism was not so much of, India was not so much of a multi-faith society, because Hinduism could absorb Buddhism and it could tame all other sectarian conflicts that emerged over the period. And we really never had to face the same kind of challenge as what we faced with the Islamic conquest. So the reason why this is called as the first challenge of secularism to Hindu society by A.K. Saran is that Islam, like Hinduism, is a social religion. So unlike Buddhism, which is a non-social religion, as I mentioned earlier, where the emphasis is on the monastic order, Islam is not like that. Islam is pretty much a social religion, conceptually very similar to Hinduism on that aspect, while there are significant differences as well. Now, Hinduism being an unorganized religion, Islam could not destroy it like it destroyed in other places. That's again a very important point, because there was temple destruction that has happened, and A.K. Saran doesn't deny that. He says that perhaps some temples have been destroyed, but the temples are not centers of the whole collective living of Hindus. They are just a part of the collective living. Like social gathering and things like that. And there are, of course, deities, and it's a home of the deity and all of that. But nevertheless, it's not the whole collective living of the Hindu society was not around temples. So there is a sense of sacred which is so pervasive in the Hindu society, where the focus, symbols, and objects that are considered holy, they are just way too many. The lakes, the trees, the place where you stand, the place where you sleep, and cities and states together. Animals, all of these are considered sacred, with everybody having their own backstories on why they are sacred. And hence, an attack on Hinduism wholesale will really mean a total destruction of all of this. And that is something that Islam could never accomplish. And neither perhaps was it desirable for them at that stage. And hence, a compromise of sorts was reached, where it's a very strange model of coexistence, but they continue to have power struggles. But it never so happened that that religion totally could, like Islam couldn't totally eat into Hinduism, neither couldn't Hinduism avoid conversion of a certain percentage of its people into Islam. And that's the backdrop. And then, of course, you have the Bhakti movement, which came in due to various frictions caused by Islam, and then due to various other historic reasons. So it is in this context that A.K. Saran says that you have had the Buddhist conflict, you have had the Islam conquest, you have had the Bhakti movement. These are all, in some sense, forms of secularism that were playing around in the society. And the solution to all these problems, they were all sought within Hinduism up until that point. But when the British came in, we could not try to find a solution within the Hindu fold. And it is here that A.K. Saran brings up this great analogy, which he keeps going back to that all through his works, what he calls as the Nilakanta syndrome. So when he says a Nilakanta syndrome, he's really alluding to Lord Shiva, who is called Nilakanta because he consumed the hala during the Samudra Manthan, the poison that came out, and he consumed it and kept it near his neck, and it kind of gives that blue color, right? And people know that the whole story around him being called Nilakanta. And A.K. Saran draws that analogy that Hindus continues to think in general that just like how Lord Shiva consumed that hala, we can consume Buddhism, we can consume Islam, we can consume Christianity, we can consume secularism, we can consume modernism. So we have this impression that we can synthesize anything. We have this impression and belief that Hinduism or Sanatan Dharma has a unique and magical power of absorbing anything, and it can absorb anything into its tradition without damaging any of the essential characteristics, and it can really synthesize the most modern and the most traditional together, which means you can be very secular and very religious at the same time. That's the kind of impression a lot of Hindu leaders and Hindu thinkers have had over the ages, and that kind of manifested in how we responded to British in the 20th century, where we assumed that we can just somehow synthesize tradition and all of these modernization forces, and we'll somehow come out of this safe. And that kind of defined our whole engagement with the concepts of secularism, nationalism, modernization, the whole thing around partition and everything else. So it is here that A.K. Saranji also tries to draw the detailing around how religion and society functioned in the Hindu view. And here he says that when you look at something like society, you're really talking about a few things here, which is a man-to-man relationship, which means how is one human interacting with other humans around him. and then a man-nature relationship, which is the relationship between man and, let's say, other non-human but visible entities like animals, lakes, mountains, trees, so on. And then you have a man and transhuman relationship, which is more of man and superhuman and existential questions on transcendental nature, spirituality, Atma, Bhagwan, and things like that. So he says that the whole humanistic or humanities framework, sociology, Indology, these kind of frameworks which try to understand the Hindu society, they can at best understand the man-man relationship or the man-nature relationship, but they can never understand this man-transhuman relationship. And he says that that's a limitation of all of these sociological kind of analysis that used to happen on trying to understand Hindu society. So one can also try to draw an analogy with the traditional concepts of Adi Bhautik, Adhyatmik, and Adi Daivik here in this context of man-man, man-nature, and man-transhuman, though the import of the Hindu terms are much, much larger than what is identified here by these phrases. So he says that sociology cannot deal with these transhuman relationships, and also about the overlapping and interpenetration between how man reacts with or man interacts with another man, with nature, and with gods. So hence he says that Hindu society cannot be understood in a non-traditional frame of reference. And he says that that's one of the gaps of why a lot of Hindus in the 20th century also are could not really understand their own religion, because one, there is a break from tradition, and another, their own understanding of their tradition was coming from studies like this, which could not give a complete picture of what it means to be a Hindu. And again here, he makes this very interesting remark in the context of Buddhism and religion society. So he says that if Buddhism is a religion that begins where society ends, he says the Hindu religion ends with society, and then Hindu spiritual, the path of Hindu spiritual discipline starts after. So he tries to draw this difference between what is called the religion tradition kind of an aspect of Hinduism and a spiritual intellectual kind of an aspect of Hinduism. So he says that the Buddhist religion, which is really a monastic order, the spiritual intellectual aspect of it was outside society, and it didn't have a social aspect, which is a religious traditional aspect that did exist with Buddhism. And with Hinduism, you have a very strong traditional religious aspect, which is on the societal plane, and then you have a very, very strong spiritual intellectual discipline, which is on the plane of an intellectual pursuit. So for which the social, the traditional part of the religion is considered as a preparation. So what happens on the societal plane is really a preparation for what goes on in the intellectual plane. That's a kind of formation which is very unique to the Hindu religion. And it is here that A.K. Saran has got some very detailed remarks and statements on the whole idea of Varnashrama Dharma, of karma, of sattva, rajas, tamas, and all of this, and how this manifested in these two components of a societal part of the religion and of an intellectual discipline and intellectual pursuit part of the religion. But these whole questions are really important because Hinduism embraces both these possibilities, A.K. Saran says, through the theory of Varnashrama Dharma. And together with the Varnashrama Dharma concept or the conception, and that along with this, the sannyasa stage and the intellectual pursuit. So you have this model where there is one societal plane which broadly operates on the Varnashrama Dharma. And then from that, at any point in time, an individual who is ready for it and who is prepared or seeking that kind of a growth or that kind of a path, he can always move to that extraordinary level of consciousness, which is in the sannyasa stage. And that is the spiritual intellectual way where people could always move to any time. And this is something that one can see, let's say, all through the Bhakti movement and even before and after, where across the classes or jatis, you could see people taking to the saintly path. And A.K. Saran says that that kind of a break from a traditional religious sphere to the spiritual intellectual sphere was a possibility that was always there in the Varnashrama Dharma kind of a framework. And then he says that so you have this religious life distinguished from a pure spiritual intellectual life, but it cannot subsist. The spiritual intellectual life, it cannot subsist without that vital social system that is functioning based on things like Varnashrama Dharma. And the reason why he says this is so is because, let's say you start asking this very famous quintessential Hindu question, right, of who am I? So on the societal plane, you get the answers to who am I and what is my Swadharma by duties that are ordained by tradition. So when you ask what is your duty, there is somebody who can give you that answer. At least there was somebody who would give you that answer. But once that tradition is absent, there is no social tradition that can give you that authoritative answer. And that's an answer or give you an answer that is also transcendentally grounded, which means it's nobody really can today give you the answer for what is my duty, which really ties both the Laukik and Paralaukik aspect together. That kind of an ecosystem is absent now. And that's the break that happened when we transitioned into this colonial epoch. And that's very different from the kind of state where we were in the Islamic conquest, or when this whole Buddhism, Hinduism thing was going on. So that's where he says that any person who is now asking this, who am I question, he doesn't get to any authoritative, transcendentally grounded answer from tradition or authorities of tradition. But the only option he has is to just abandon society and follow the spiritual, intellectual way of inquiry. But what if he is not capable? Not everybody is capable of going through that path of a pure spiritual, intellectual way of being of a sannyasi or a siddha or a rishi, so on. Now, what if I'm not equal to that? In such a case, you really have no possibility of a religious life, and you end up discovering or inventing various pseudo-religions, pseudo-spirituality, scientism, psychology, psychoanalysis, or some kind of a civil religion. And this really is what is happening in our times. If you see that you have this break from tradition of the religio-traditional part of the societal part of Hindu religion, where nobody is really able to answer this question of what is my duty in the context of what is my Swadharma. They're just saying that you discover your own Swadharma, which is pretty much not giving an answer really, because if I'm capable of discovering my own Swadharma, I wouldn't be asking that question in the first place. So you have this model where that part is broken, and then not everybody can really become a Ramana Maharshi. So people are stuck. They really want some kind of a transcendental anchor for their lives. They feel that absence, but there is nothing that is coming as a midway. Nobody is telling them their duty, and they cannot become Ramana Maharshis. So they are stuck. And it is in this context that you can see various kinds of pseudo-religions, cults, and sects that have emerged in the last 100 years. You have pseudo-spirituality, scientism, psychology, and all of these things that has emerged. So that's where A.K. Saran says that without a societal organization based on Hindu traditional principles, an ordinary person cannot be Hindu in the religious sense of the term. So let me repeat, because it's a very, very important line, which not too many people say this in public forums. And it's important to understand that, because that kind of differentiates the depth of thinking that somebody like A.K. Saran did in the 20th century. So he says that without a societal organization based on Hindu traditional principles, an ordinary person cannot be a Hindu in the religious sense of the term. So you can still say that I was born a Hindu, I'm a Hindu, but in the religious sense of a term, in the absence of a societal organization that is based on Hindu traditional principles, it is very difficult for you to claim that you are a Hindu in the religious sense of the term. In any other type of society, or in fact all societies, there is room for spirituality and of course Hindu spirituality. But Hindu religion cannot be accommodated in every other type of society. It needs a Hindu society to be accommodated, because it is inseparable from a certain way of life for the average individual. And this distinction between religion and spirituality, A.K. Saran says, may or may not be true for Christianity and Islam, but it is very, very important for understanding Hindu tradition that there is something called a Hindu religion and there is something else called a Hindu spirituality. Though both are connected, but they both perform very, very different functions. So when therefore one speaks of their own personal realization as the essence of Hinduism, they are really talking about Hindu spirituality, which is they are just talking about their own solitary individual pursuit of trying to realize the Parabrahma and that kind of thing, which is what A.K. Saran calls is the Sankhya way of Gita. And but that's only for a select few. And one can also say that it's not specifically Hindu in that sense, that anybody can really take into that kind of an intellectual and spiritual kind of a path and try to become a sannyasi. That there's nothing really prohibiting them from taking that kind of a path. But what A.K. Saran is trying to draw is that if you take out that plane of a spiritual intellectual path, And if somebody wants to just be a Hindu in the material plane in a very societal sense of it, it is very, very difficult now in the absence of traditional structures that were telling you what your Swadharma was. And in contemporary India, A.K. Saran says that what is still alive is an unbroken historical tradition of 5,000 years or even more, which is the Hindu spirituality. So we still have Upanishads, we still have Gita, we still have our Puranas, and we still have many other things like that, which are floating around in books, in PDFs, and in terms of oral transmission. But all of this is really the Hindu spirituality part of it, which is anyway like timeless, and it's going to stay even, let's say, 1,000 years hence. That part of Hindu spirituality will really stay. That's really not what A.K. Saran is talking about here. He says, while the spirituality part of Hinduism is staying, what has disintegrated is Hindu religion, which is the institutional translation of the same intellectual spiritual tradition. So you have this intellectual spiritual tradition of the Vedas, of the Upanishads, and of everything else. And the institutional translation of this was what is the Hindu religion of, let's say, the Varnashrama Dharma and things like that, or Samanya Dharma for that matter. And it is this break that A.K. Saran says that all through those 5 centuries of Islamic domination, we didn't face this kind of a conflict, and we are facing it only after the British conquest or after the colonial epoch. And it is here that he says that a lot of thinkers, particularly like Indian thinkers, scholars, politicians, they all think that what is going on today in the name of modernization and secularization, it will not affect in any significant manner the religiousness of contemporary Indian society. And A.K. Saran says that it is quite wrong to think that, and it is plainly false that if you are able to even understand the essence of what he tried to portray through his lectures and essays, he says that it is impossible to synthesize the currents of modernization and secularization and also try to be religious in the same sense of how your ancestors were, and try to construct this new contemporary Indian society. Because Hinduism as a religion, there was a regulated way of life. And that kind of a regulated way of life, as he mentioned in his, as I mentioned in A.K. Saran's earlier works, is that the tradition has really broken. And what remains unaffected is only the Hindu spirituality part of it. And what has disintegrated is this Hindu society part of it. So because that has disintegrated, and then we have this false impression that we can somehow synthesize secularization and modernization, what we are now ending up is with this flavor of Hinduism, which finds expression in various forms of intolerance, violence, and fanaticism. And that is something which is quite valid for the times that A.K. Saranji was alive and the times now, that if you look around and take out secularism, secularization and modernization, and try to understand and take out the spiritual, intellectual path of Hinduism, and then ask the average Hindu what it is what does it mean to be a Hindu, the answer really is on these things of sentiments, intolerance, fanaticism, so on. Because the Hindu religious part of our life is quite broken. Not fully, I'd say, not totally annihilated. You still have your home, you still have your puja rooms, and you still have your family customs. But as a societal component, we are not a Hindu society anymore. And hence, that's where A.K. Saran says this paragraph, which I had quoted earlier in some of my other public interactions, that he says that the essential underlying problem of a long line of Hindu religious social reformers from the medieval Bhakti saints through Raja Ram Mohan Rai of Brahma Samaj, Swami Vivekananda, Mahatma Gandhi, Vinoba Bhave, all of them, they have been trying to find a new contemporaneous social form for maintaining the continuity between Hindu spirituality and Hindu religion, which was once achieved by Varnashrama Dharma. So there was this continuity between Hindu spirituality and Hindu religion, which was hitherto achieved by Varnashrama Dharma, which doesn't exist anymore. And a long line of these reformers, they were all trying to somehow innovate and find this contemporaneous social form, which can be a good replacement and still be traditional for Varnashrama Dharma, and that never emerged. And this effort of this century of reforms, it has also confused itself by a failure to distinguish properly between Hindu religion, which is coterminous with society, requiring a contemporaneous historical form, and Hindu intellectuality and spirituality, which transcends society and history. So a lot of our reformers really didn't understand the difference between these two streams of Hinduism. And behind this failure and the general unsuccess so far of all these great line of Hindu reformers, that's where the deeper tensions within the Hindu tradition and the inner compulsions of Indian history lie. That's what A.K. Saran says, that this failure to kind of find these alternative forms, alternative social forms that can help us lead a dharmic life on a material plane, let's say on a Grihastha Dharma kind of a model, because we failed to find those contemporary alternatives. We ended up succumbing to several other of these forces, and now you have these very, very strong currents of secularization and modernization, and this whole new flavor of Hinduism that is all about trying to shout against an external enemy. There is a fanaticism aspect of it, and that kind of also has manifested in the other religion, which is Islam in this case, where Islam also in some sense is struggling with the same currents, because it could not transform itself the same way Christianity transformed itself through these currents of secularization and modernization. Although there are so many Christian scholars and religious people today who bemoan the transition. And so we have this strange predicament in our times. And it's here again that A.K. Saran tries to emphasize that all conquests of India were perhaps anti-Hinduism, but they were never anti-religion until the colonial epoch. It is in the colonial epoch that for the first time that we had these two forces of secularization and modernization that came along with the colonial forces, which were essentially trying to design this kind of a new religion where the space for religion was continuously shrinking, and this thing of an autonomy of man and a scientific humanistic kind of a worldview kind of emerged. So that differentiation is what A.K. Saran tries to build here, where he's saying that all your prior conquests were anti-Hinduism, but this conquest is anti-religion or anti-tradition, and that really is a very distinguishing factor of the colonial epoch, and we don't seem to study that enough. We just assume that it can be synthesized like everything else. And again, here A.K. Saran says that that does not mean that like he's trying to discount what happened to Hindu society in the Islamic conquest. He says that while that did happen, he says that Hindu civilization is not profoundly different from the Islamic civilization in the sense that they are both traditional, transcendent centered civilizations. In that, they are both otherworldly civilizations. Just as how like the American technological industrial civilization and the Soviet civilization, they are both rooted in the same technological industrial complex. So that's a comparison that A.K. Saran tries to draw, that your American style capitalism and Soviet style communism, they are both rooted in the same technological industrial civilizational model, just like how Hinduism and several other Islam and many other pagan religions, they were all rooted in the transcendental civilizational model. And that's the differentiation that A.K. Saran tries to draw with the colonial epoch, that once you had the Britishers come in, along with their whole bunch of ideologies around colonization, although they had a Christian baggage and a missionary component to all of this, but that's not what really destroyed the Hindu society then. And what destroyed the Hindu society is these ideologies around the scientific industrial way of life being the only way forward, and these ideologies of secularization and modernization, which the colonial epoch kind of tried to mainstream all through the world. And that's here that A.K. Saran tries to delve very deep into a lot of the thinking of reformers of that era, where he says that be it Brahma Samaj, be it Arya Samaj, or be it Devi Samaj, or many other Samajas of that era, they were really trying to rationalize Hinduism and trying to modernize the Indian society. And they somehow assume that all of this will not make too much of a dent into what is the core of Hindu tradition. And this is where A.K. Saran also tries to draw this very, very interesting parallel between Ramakrishna Paramahamsa and Swami Vivekananda, where he says that Ramakrishna Paramahamsa was personally successful in that sense of his siddhi and how he attained moksha in that sense, that Ramakrishna Paramahamsa can be considered as a success. And Swami Vivekananda's efforts, A.K. Saran says, were a historical failure, because Swami Vivekananda was trying to like revamp the entire Hindu societal life, Hindu civilization, so on. And his pursuit was not just like Ramakrishna Paramahamsa's of just like something in the spiritual intellectual track of personal success or siddhi. It was not that kind of a path. And it is this example that A.K. Saran takes, and he says that from that point onward, there could be Hindu saints, but no Hindu society. So he says that you can always have Hindu saints like, let's say, Ramakrishna Paramahamsa or Ramana Maharshi and people like that come up, but you may not have a Hindu society from that point on, because that's where the colonial epoch kind of seeped deep into the Hindu consciousness, and we were unable to recover from that yet. And talking about Arya Samaj, A.K. Saran says that while Arya Samaj tries to go back to the infallibility of Vedas and back to the Vedas kind of a model, they also couldn't really understand, and they hit into this inevitable difficulty that Vedic institutions can function only in a Vedic society, which again goes back to the previous point on you can have a Hindu saint, you can have the Hindu Vedic kind of a discourse on the spiritual plane, but you still cannot have a Hindu society because of these fundamental conflicts with the ideologies of that era. And with Gandhi, it was different in some sense, because Gandhi was very distinct from all of these social reformers in that sense that he was also very deeply critical about the whole scientific industrial kind of a model, or the conflicts between a total surrender to a technological way of life and tradition. So Gandhi, like many people think, was not so much anti-technology. He was really trying to understand these conflicts between a complete surrender to a technological way of life and then traditional way of life. So he was trying to understand what these two things mean, and he tried to innovate on his own paths. And independent India, of course, repudiated Gandhi completely and formally, because the flavor of the season then with let's say people like Nehru, with Ambedkar and many other leaders then, that they all continue to believe that there is a synthesis of traditional Indian values and Western values. It is possible. So Nehru perhaps was too much into the secularization discourse, and in the later part of his life, he was somewhat critical of modernization. Ambedkar, of course, had his own journey where he was not so rooted in the Hindu tradition for his own reasons, and he tried to root himself in the Buddhist tradition. But essentially, they all assumed that the traditional moorings or the traditional way of life could be synthesized with a modern Western scientific, technological, industrial way of life. And that is where A.K. Saran tries to say that you have an undying tradition and you have a dead society in the Hindu context. That he's very emphatic about that, where he says that he writes this in the 70s, and he says, today there is no living Hindu society in India. And he says that the process of the decay of Hindu society and religion, which must be distinguished from Hindu spirituality, it began very long ago. And it reached a decisive phase during India's encounter with Islam, and continued in a different form throughout the comparatively brief but radically significant period of the British rule. And it has taken yet another form in independent India. And he says that so far, he has not seen a sign of genuine renewal in terms of trying to bring that Hindu society back to life. And in 70s, he's making this statement in the 70s, and he says that the future is dark, more so because our vision is obscured by a false light. And the false light, broadly speaking, in the context of A.K. Saran, is the Nilakanta syndrome of us assuming that we can somehow synthesize all of these currents of secularization, modernization, and somehow still be traditional. So that's the broad thesis around which A.K. Saran operated. And he continues to emphasize that one has no way of being Hindu and leading an authentic human life, Hindu human life, if there is no traditional society in which he can participate. So the Hindu tradition in the spiritual intellectual mode is perennially alive, but the religio-social mode is in utter decay today, he says. And he says that very soon, the modernizing and scientizing tendencies will also enter the intellectual spiritual mode. And that is something that one could say that he's quite prophetic of. He wrote this in the 70s, and then now we see that this whole scientific and modernizing tendencies, they have also gotten into the intellectual spiritual mode. And there are all sorts of commentaries that one can see today on Gita, on Veda, on Upanishads, where and even on rituals, for example, where they are trying to give a scientific and secular kind of an explanation for each of those forms. And hence, this is a very strong statement, though, and it's not like I'm trying to endorse actions on those lines through this talk. It is more of a intellectual journey. And A.K. Saran says that there is a fundamental incompatibility between Hindu society and the secular technological civilization. So he's not saying that Hindus don't have technology, don't have science. In fact, there's a very beautiful paper he has written on that. I can give a reference to that as well to the organizers, so that can be put onto the video as well. So he doesn't say that Hindu society is anti-science or anti-technology, or we should reject science and reject technology, but he's referring to a certain form or certain ideologies that have gained current over the past few centuries, and the whole flavor that of ideas that we see in this secular technological civilization, and those ideas specifically, he says, are incompatible with the Hindu society. And we need to understand what are the values of a Hindu Vedic society, what are the values of a Vedic society which can be compatible with the values of a technological society, and what are those values which are not. So that's a kind of analysis that needs to be performed. And he draws this differentiation primarily because, in his own words, one very distinguishing factor of a technological society is that we stopped asking this question of what ought I do, which is what should I do or what must I do. We are just asking this question of what can I do, which means that you have figured out a way to do something. So you are just saying, can I do this? I'll do this. But you're not asking this question of what should I do, what ought I do, so on. So Hindu political parties, A.K. Saran says, they are sensing this real challenge between tradition and these forces of secularism and technological society, but they are unwilling to accept this, and they are trying to obscure this by their own feeble, fragile, reluctant awareness, or by the synthesis ideology, which I referred to multiple times during this talk. So a lot of the leadership, both the scholars and a lot of these political parties, he's talking about 70s, so it's not some anti-BJP or anti-Narendra Modi kind of rhetoric, which sometimes people tend to associate some of these talks that, oh, this is all Hindu, but they seem to be anti-BJP. But it's not that. I mean, A.K. Saran's this particular discourse was even before BJP became, let's say, or even the Hindutva movement became a political power. So he's just making a general remark that Hindu political parties do sense this challenge to tradition by these forces of secularization and by the force of a technological society, but they are unwilling to accept this challenge, and they obscure this by their false belief and a false faith in the synthesis ideology that we can somehow synthesize all of this, and they instead project Pakistan or project Islam as a threat to Hinduism, and that kind of creates a false consciousness, is what A.K. Saran says, that all of your energies are vested into understanding the threat to Hinduism from Pakistan, from Islam, or any other such forces, but you are not spending enough time in trying to understand what is happening to your own tradition in this whole path of secularization and modernization. And this is where he says that the fact that Hindu intellectuals and Hindu scholars could not develop a systematic theory of society and state which could be traditional and adequate to the needs of the contemporary plural society of India, that has been a failure. And this non-contemporaneity of Hindu consciousness also throws light on the fact that a large number of Hindus joined the nationalistic freedom movement led by Congress and others at that time. They joined without being personally committed to secular nationalism. A lot of them didn't even understand some of these undercurrents at that time. And a lot of them, they just somehow believed that these ideologies won't sharply conflict with Hindu tradition, and somehow they can synthesize. And they really didn't have a kind of an intellectual basis for resisting the secularization of contemporary society. And Hindus who did not accept, let's say, the two-nation theory of separation between India and Pakistan, even those, they could not work out this kind of a contemporary traditional form of personal law of some kind of a hierarchical or quasi-hierarchical principle of social organization. And they just lacked this kind of an imagination at that time, or they perhaps were still thinking, or the forces that they were trying to fight against was, and those currents was perhaps too strong. But this happened, that we could not provide a contemporary but traditional form of social organization at that time. And because of this, it has led to the decline of what A.K. Saran is calling the Hindu society, where he's saying that there's no living Hindu society. And it is here that this kind of a consciousness, he says, is lacking in a lot of Hindus. And hence, the loyalty to Hinduism is expressed in fanatical and therefore necessarily sentimental forms of agitation, of dharnas, of demonstrations against, let's say, cow slaughter, against Pakistan, what A.K. Saran calls anti-Muslimism or anti-Pakistanism. So you have this fanatic, sentimental approach, and a clear-headed, responsible approach is missing. And because we have not thought of some of these other issues that are at hand, and that kind of a consciousness is pretty much absent in that era. And I think it is pretty much absent even in this era. And that's why some of these fanatical or us versus them kind of tendencies have actually increased much more in the past few decades. I'm not attributing it to a particular government per se, but this is a current and this is something that has been documented all through the world. So it's not necessarily an Indian phenomenon per se, where as these forces of secularization and modernization gain current, a lot of these fanatical and sentimental forms of expressing one's religion, where the identity really comes from bad-mouthing your enemy or highlighting the threat to your religion from the enemy, these kind of tendencies have kind of emerged over time. So that's broadly something I wanted to cover through this talk. So at a high level, the broad takeaways really were to understand how secularism and secularization as a force have emerged, understand the context of how they emerged in Western Europe, the Christian underpinnings of it, and how Christianity responded to that secularism, and how Hinduism had its own currents with Buddhism, with Islam, and how with the colonial epoch, they all kind of came through. And this force of secularization and modernization came along with the colonial conquest. And then that really led to a new situation where for the first time, Hinduism was trying to attack a force which was not just a different religion. It was fundamentally against all forms of religion and all forms of tradition. Despite the Christian underpinnings of the colonial epoch, what really disturbed the Hindu society was these forces of secularization and modernization. And it is high time that we try to critically understand these forces of modernization and engage with it critically. So as one of my recent contacts that I got to know from internet, it's a professor who works in a law school in Hyderabad, and he made this very nice remark, which I think is good for this audience, is that just as how today we critically engage with Hinduism, we critically engage with Islam, critically engage with Christianity, try to also critically engage with the forces of secularization and modernization. And in that context, also try to critically engage with the currents of reformism, try to critically engage with the currents of technological society. Don't just assume that it is value neutral or it won't impact your traditional mold and you can somehow synthesize. It is important to critically engage with each of these ideologies and forces and then try to figure out alternatives. And I know a lot of this sounds very theoretical. So there is this quote by Keynes, which A.K. Saran also refers to in his books. It's quite popular, but very important in this context, that madmen in authority who hear voices in the air, they are really distilling their frenzy from some academic scribble of a few years back. So somebody might have scribbled something few years back, few decades back, and that is now playing out in the heads of all these madmen who are in authority. And he says that the power of vested interest is vastly exaggerated compared with the gradual encroachment of ideas. So this whole discourse, really, you need to see it in terms of the history of ideas, in terms of the power of ideas on the minds of people. And you need to see whether we can come up with new ideological frameworks that can help us continue to survive as Hindus in a Hindu society, rather than all of us trying to become Ramana Maharshis. I don't mean any disrespect to Ramana Maharshi, by the way. Somebody that I adore personally, but I'm just trying to draw that imaginary that you have this whole spiritual, intellectual part of Hinduism, which is still alive and thriving, but that's not a path that everybody could take. Let's say tomorrow, I can't do that tomorrow, you can't do that tomorrow. So that's why the societal and the public facing part of Hinduism is just as much important for practicing Hindus. And the whole discourse that I've tried to bring up here through the ideas of A.K. Saran was to emphasize on this fact that going back to how A.K. Saran started this article of 1970 on Hinduism, that there is no living Hindu society in India. So we should not let that continue. And at some point in time, we should also be able to say that we have a living Hindu society in India. We are all Hindus in a religious sense of the word. And we also have the thriving Hindu spiritual, intellectual tradition. So that's the hope that at some point we'll probably be able to frame that kind of a discourse. And again, as I say, all of this is very theoretical. So just to end on a jovial note, that today, as I was preparing for this talk, I was reading some of the books of A.K. Saran, so I don't misrepresent some of his ideas here. And I was pulled into this apartment association meeting. So you have these 200, 300 flats in the community, and then they all meet to discuss their issues, elections, and all of that. It happens all over the place. So I was carrying this book and I was reading in between when the meeting was going on. And then a couple of folks came to me. So one of them asked, "What is it that you're reading?" So I personally found it very embarrassing to explain secularization and modernization and contemporary Hindu society and all these ideas in an apartment association meeting. So I just told him that it is just philosophy. So he gave me some kind of a look and then went off. Then one more person came and then he said, "I want to see what is written on that book." So he took that book, he reads, okay, secularism, modernization, Hindu society, and then he looks at me, he looks back at the book, gives the book back to me, and then goes off. And then one more person came in the end, and then he asked, why are you even doing all this? Are you a professor? So all of these things sound very theoretical, and a lot of people are not naturally drawn on to it. So I understand that. But I think for concerned Hindus, for people who are interested in civilizational issues, in the whole Indic dharmic discourse, these kind of a discourse is very, very important. And these are really the real hard questions that we need to ask. And we can stand on the shoulders of great thinkers like A.K. Saran of the 20th century and many, many other traditional gurus and scholars and authors. And we need to build the discourse from there so that we will someday have a living, thriving Hindu society at some point of time in future. So thanks to Indus University and the organizers for giving me this opportunity. I hope I didn't bore you with a lot of theory, and some of this will really help you in terms of your own intellectual reading journey in terms of engaging with this kind of thinking. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, like I think we can take one of the questions. I see some question already posted, right? There is a question from Satish, where he says that like he heard me say this thing on the kinship with Marxism, and then he says that Marxism derives from one God, one philosophy, and one state. Okay, so I think that's an interesting question, but the difference here was only between the transcendental aspect. So while the godliness of some of the things around Marxists might be coming from their own ideology. So they might have, let's say, and if you go to some of the houses of devout Marxists, they actually have the photo of Karl Marx and Engels put in their puja room. So in that context, they might have created gods out of Marx and Engels. But broadly speaking, there is no transcendental aspect to Marx. It's all a very this worldly, humanistic kind of an aspect. And that is where A.K. Saran kinds of trying to draw a parallel that if you take out the transcendental aspects, all ideologies will have a fundamental kinship with Marx, because if once you take out the transcendental aspects, a lot of these things around equalizing and liberty, fraternity, they come down to they all run around some of these Marxist ideologies. So that's the difference that he's trying to bring, that it's a non-transcendental philosophy, and Hinduism, Islam, and things like that, they were transcendental philosophy. So yeah, I see this one, that any suggestions on which book is a good start. So I think a couple of links have been posted here by Ravi. So you have this article on the crisis of Hinduism, which is very good. Some of it I have referred to in the talk today. And then there are, you can find all of his books listed on the link there of Aditya Prakashan. You can pick these two books that I referred to at the early part of the talk, of secularism and modernization, and then Hinduism in contemporary India. He has written some very, very good books on Marxism as well, trying to understand that thought. So, and then he has written books on traditional man, intellectual vocation, several other topics. You can find all of that listed there on that link, and you can pick and choose.
As A.K. Saran says, that without Hindu society, we can have Hindu saints. And he provides an example like Ramana Maharshi and Ramakrishna Paramahansa. But as you have seen, the society, the decay in the societal sphere doesn't leave the intellectual, spiritual sphere untainted. They eventually catch up. So, as you have said, the transcendent related world and scientific industrial world, the religious world, we can say. So, I think we can simplify it that the first one is the religious world and the second one is a atheistic world, an atheistic world. So, and the three theories of secularization that A.K. Saran refers, he also coexistence, contemporaneity and autonomy. He also says that ultimately it's the Marxist one which gives the backbone, something like that, I believe.
Right, right.
So can we say, for simplification term, that much of our discourse has been framed like secularism is Christian secularism, the decolonization talk that goes on, it frames secularism as a Christian secularism, as if there can be something called Hindu secularism which will help us in the process. But as for my understanding, I think secularism is more of an atheistic process than a theistic one. So will we be justified to simplify it in terms of the atheism and theism?
Okay, sure. I think there's a lot of things there, but to the last part that you mentioned on the decolonial discourse, particularly, let's say, the ones propagated by the S.N. Balagangadhara kind of a school, they did a lot of work in the recent past trying to attribute secular, like very strong Christian roots to secularism. So A.K. Saran also talks about that in his works, where while, as I mentioned at the early part, while the secularism did start in a Christian context, and then Christianity kind of transformed itself in a certain way. So to tag along with secularism, so you have this secular theology that emerged there. You have what is also called Christian atheism by some scholars, which has emerged there. So those forces are there. But what we need to understand is your larger question is that can secularism exist in a non-secular society? Which is that can you have a Hindu society but a secular state and things like that, right? So those are not, those are framings that we need to really try to understand more, because we don't have a very good understanding of this whole baggage that comes along with secularization. As you mentioned, rightly pointed out, while there are these three variants of secularism that A.K. Saran talks about, of separating religion, like the church and state, and thinking religion is a private affair, what really eventually comes to dominate is this thing on the autonomy of man and this whole scientific, humanistic, empirical kind of a framework, which has a very good happy marriage with Karl Marx. So that is the ideology that kind of dominates when you get down to the secularism path, that essentially they're trying to make you communist and atheist. So you can definitely draw this analogy that you have atheism that is morphed as secularism and modernization that is coming through these societies. And that is something that we need to understand and resist both intellectually and in other forms of engagement.
There's a question that comes to my mind that, you do mention scholars like A.K. Saran, then you mention Anand Kumar Swamy. When they were attacking, or they were critically analyzing these thoughts like ideas of modernity, secularism, secularization, what was it that didn't allow us to catch up with this critical analysis? Like we caught up with other criticism of, let's say, external enemies or Islam or Christianity. We caught up with that sort of discourse. But what happened that we missed it? Even though A.K. Saran was critically analyzing modernization back in 1970s.
Right. I think it's a very important question. And if you read one of these books in the introduction, the people who edited these books, right, they actually talk about this journey of A.K. Saran, that he didn't get a good recognition even within academia, because a lot of his discourse was troubling the status quo so much that he didn't even get the kind of chairs and scholarships and things like that within academia. And these kind of people are really, really marginalized because they upset the status quo. So you can stay within academia if you are towing the leftist line. You can also stay within academia if you are slightly anti-critical of the left, because they want to keep that guy also on the bench just for the sake of argument. So that whole model operates in that way, that they try to keep those two forces. But anybody who is deeply critical of this kind of a discourse of modernity in this sense, they have a problem. If you are deeply critical of modernity, let's say in the Walter Mignolu or decoloniality kind of a sense, it's still okay, because they don't tell you what to do after decoloniality. But people like A.K. Saran tell you that you have your own tradition, and they talk the traditional language in English, of course, to say that you have to go there. And that really upsets a lot of dynamic and a lot of politics. So there's this word that Ashish Nandi, he uses in one of his discussions with another scholar of his kind called Ananya Vajpayee, where somebody asks that there is this book written in Telugu by a scholar called Rani Shivashankar Sharma. The book is called Last Brahmin. That also kind of deals with these themes of tradition and modernity. It got translated into English, and then this thing comes up that why is nobody talking about this book? It was written in, let's say, like 2001, 2003, and it actually talks about all these themes. How come it's not popular? And Ashish Nandi says, this is what I call the politics of knowledge, that because there is a politics of knowledge under play, not all ideas are going to get the same currency. And that is why I think it's very encouraging to see these alternative forms of media emerge in our times today. We are not doing this discourse in a typical university setup, though I know Indus University is still a university, but it's not a university in the same sense as a JNU or things like that, right? So it's a different form of university, and you have internet, and all the people who are on this call, very few of them are really academics or researchers. So these are all alternative forums that are now emerging, because this kind of a discourse is pretty much made impossible in a university setup, in academia, in publishing. And these are now new forces that are emerging. Perhaps if this was possible in A.K. Saran's era, maybe he would have been a social media superstar. I don't know. But right now, that's what it is. So, yeah.
Such a wonderful thought, where you say that, decoloniality is right, but what do you do once you're decolonialized? Where do you go? That is an answer that we do not get. And it has become easier to say that we need to do away with coloniality. But what coloniality spans as is still not talked about. So modernization, secularization, these are also a part of that greater colonialization of Hindu mind, Hindu society, Hindu religion in itself. Right.
So this breakdown of the Hindu society aspect of it, which A.K. Saran emphasizes, that's not something most people get. So I can give an example from my own business school experience, right? So as you guys mentioned in the introduction, I studied at IIM Lucknow, which is one of the big schools in the country, popular. And we had this course where it's called Leadership Through Literature, where they are trying to pick literary works and trying to get leadership ideals and all of that from there. And incidentally, there was some mention of Bhagavad Gita and all that in that course. So there was this professor who talks about a lot about Swadharma. We should do our Swadharma. Each of you should do your Swadharma, and you should excel and all of that. And then I raised my hand and asked, but professor, tell me, what is my Swadharma? And he says, you figure out, you just look within whatever you are passionate about, that is your Swadharma. So that's the discourse, right? And you don't know what you should do. You like, okay, I decolonize myself, I'll do my Swadharma, but what is my Swadharma? Then it's like, you figure out. And that really, he's pretty much saying like there's no real answer there for it, right? So that's the gap we have as a Hindu society, where that whole authoritative or traditional paramparas that used to exist across jatis, they used to answer that question of what is my Swadharma, and now that is destroyed, and there's no alternative that has been put. So you really don't know what to do when you want to embrace Dharma, right? There's nothing to practice, and like I mentioned, all of us cannot become saints. So we are stuck, and it is in this that we get into, a lot of us, in fact, this kind of people are also pulled into Marxist discourse, pulled into the reformist discourse, and because they don't know what else to do, how else to engage. And some of them are also pulled into this anti-Islam and that kind of discourse, because they want to somehow exhibit their Hindu identity. And in the absence of everything else, this is all that is left. Either be a reformist, be the anti-Muslim kind of a guy, or be the party supporter, and things like that, right? So that's where we are. And I think we need to somehow figure out a way out of this. It's a slippery slope otherwise.